On the 24th of August, 394 of the Common Era, a priest named Esmet Akom stood before the gate of the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, at the southern frontier of Egypt, and carved an inscription into the stone. The inscription was written in two scripts, hieroglyphic and demotic, and it was a dedication to Mandulis, a Nubian sun god who was worshipped alongside Isis at the temple. The hieroglyphic portion is brief. The carving is competent, but not elegant, the work of a man who knew the forms, but who lacked the fluency of the master scribes who had carved the temple walls centuries earlier. The inscription is not, by any standard of Egyptian epigraphy, a masterpiece, but it is the most important inscription in the history of Egyptian writing, because it is the last one, the last dated hieroglyphic inscription ever carved. The final sentence in a written language that had been in continuous use for more than 3,500 years, from the earliest pictographic signs scratched on pre-dynastic pottery to this small dedication on a gate at the edge of the world. After Esmet Akum put down his chisel, no one would carve another hieroglyph. The language of the pharaohs, the script of the gods, the writing system that had documented 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization. From the construction of the pyramids to the conquest of Nubia, from the hymns of the pyramid texts to the medical prescriptions of the Ebers papyrus, fell silent, not because the script was forgotten overnight, but because the world that sustained it was dying, and the temple on the island of Philae was the last place on earth where that world still lived. The Temple of Philae is not the largest temple in Egypt, it is not the oldest, it is not the most architecturally innovative, but it is, in one crucial sense, the most important. It is the last ancient Egyptian temple to function as an active place of worship, the last outpost of the old religion, holding on for more than a century, after every other temple in Egypt had been closed by imperial decree. The last place where the gods of Egypt were fed, clothed, and honoured according to the rituals that had been practiced without interruption since the dawn of pharaonic civilization. And the temple survived not once but twice. In the 1970s, when the rising waters of Lake Nasser threatened to drown Philae forever, a UNESCO-led team dismantled the entire temple complex, 40,000 stones, weighing 27,000 tons, and reassembled it on a neighbouring island called Agilkia, 200 metres from its original location. The operation took 8 years, and it saved, from certain destruction, the building where Egyptian civilization spoke its last words. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why Philae outlasted every other temple in Egypt, how the worship of Isis sustained itself for more than a century after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, what the last hieroglyphic inscription tells us about the death of a language and a civilization, and why the island temple of the goddess of magic was saved from the waters by an act of modern engineering that the goddess herself might have appreciated. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Philae, begin with its location, because at Philae, location is everything. The island of Philae sat in the Nile, just above the first cataract of Aswan, the point where the river narrowed, the current quickened, and the smooth-flowing Nile became a tumbling, boulder-strewn rapids that marked the traditional southern boundary of Egypt. Below the cataract was Egypt, the fertile valley, the civilized world, the domain of the pharaoh and the gods. Above the cataract was Nubia, the wild south, the land of gold and mystery, the territory of peoples who worshipped their own gods, and who resisted Egyptian domination with varying degrees of success over 3 millennia. Philae sat exactly on this boundary. The island, small, roughly 450 metres long, and less than 200 metres wide, rose from the Nile between the two worlds. It was neither fully Egyptian nor fully Nubian. It was a border zone, a threshold, a place between, and in Egyptian mythology, places between had special power. The boundary between the cultivated land and the desert was sacred. The boundary between the East Bank and the West Bank was sacred, and the boundary between Egypt and Nubia, the cataract, the rapids, the place where the Nile changed its nature, was the most sacred boundary of all. The Egyptians believed that the first cataract was one of the sources of the Nile, one of the places where the waters of the primordial ocean burst forth from the underworld into the world of the living. The god Khnum, who controlled the flood, was worshipped at nearby Elephantine Island, and Isis, the goddess of magic, motherhood, and resurrection, was worshipped at Philae, the island that sat in the middle of the sacred waters, surrounded by the sound of the rapids, enveloped in the mist of the cataract, positioned at the exact point where the divine waters emerged from the underworld. The mythology of Philae was specific and powerful. The Egyptians believed that one of the burial places of Osiris, the god of the dead, the husband of Isis, the father of Horus, was located on the nearby island of Bigay, visible from Philae across a narrow channel of water. According to the temple inscriptions, Osiris's left leg was buried on Bigay, and the island was so sacred that no human being was permitted to set foot on it. Only birds could land on Bigay. Only the priests of Isis, at specific times and under specific ritual conditions, could approach the island, and even then, they did not step onto its soil. They performed their rites from the water, from boats, reaching across the boundary between the living and the dead to tend the burial of the god. Isis, mourning her dead husband across the narrow channel, was the presiding presence of Philae. The island was her domain, the temple was her house, and the worship of Isis at Philae was not merely a local cult, it was an international phenomenon, one of the most widespread and most enduring religious movements in the ancient world. The cult of Isis spread from Egypt to Greece, to Rome, to North Africa, to Spain, to Gaul, to Britain, to the far corners of the Roman Empire. Isis was worshipped in Athens. She was worshipped in Pompeii. She was worshipped in London. She was the Great Mother, the Queen of Heaven, the Mistress of Magic, the goddess who had reassembled the dismembered body of her husband and brought him back from the dead. Her worship transcended national boundaries, linguistic barriers, and cultural differences, and the temple at Philae was the mother house, the sacred center from which the Isis cult radiated outward to the entire Mediterranean world. The temple complex that stands today on Agilkia Island, the relocated replica of the original Philae, was built primarily during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century of the Common Era. The main temple of Isis was begun by Ptolemy II Philadelphus around 285 BC and was expanded, decorated, and modified by his successors over the following 3 centuries. Roman emperors Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Trajan, Hadrian added structures, inscriptions, and decorative programs to the complex, maintaining the tradition of pharaonic temple building long after Egypt had become a Roman province. The result is a temple complex that is neither purely Egyptian nor purely Roman, but a synthesis of both. A building that follows the traditional Egyptian temple plan while incorporating Roman architectural elements, Roman decorative motifs, and Roman imperial imagery. The great pylon of the Temple of Isis is Egyptian in form, a massive trapezoidal gateway decorated with colossal relief scenes of the pharaoh smiting enemies before the gods. But the pharaoh depicted on the pylon is not a pharaoh. He is a Roman emperor, Ptolemy XII or Augustus, dressed in pharaonic regalia, performing pharaonic rituals, claiming pharaonic authority. The building is Egyptian, the builder is foreign, and the combination, Egyptian form, foreign content, defines the peculiar character of Philae. The cult of Isis was not merely one of many ancient religions. It was, by the 1st century of the Common Era, the closest thing the ancient Mediterranean world had to a universal religion. Isis was worshipped under dozens of names and in dozens of forms, as the Queen of Heaven, the Star of the Sea, the Mother of God, the Lady of the House of Life. Her worship was practiced in temples from the Nile to the Rhine, from the Euphrates to the Atlantic. Roman soldiers carried her image to the frontiers of the empire. Greek philosophers wrote hymns to her wisdom. Egyptian priests maintained her ancient rituals, and ordinary people, farmers, merchants, slaves, aristocrats, turned to her in moments of crisis, praying for healing, for fertility, for safe passage, for resurrection after death. The universality of the Isis cult is one of the most remarkable phenomena in the religious history of the ancient world. No other deity of the pre-Christian era achieved such widespread and diverse worship. Zeus was worshipped by Greeks. Jupiter was worshipped by Romans. Marduk was worshipped by Babylonians. Each deity was bound to a specific culture, a specific language, a specific geographical territory. Isis transcended all of these boundaries. She was Egyptian, she was Greek, she was Roman. She was African, Asian, European. She belonged to no single culture, and she was claimed by all of them. The Temple at Philae was the source of this universality. It was the mother house, the original, the authentic, the genuine temple of Isis, from which all other Isis temples derived their authority and their liturgical traditions. The priests at Philae were the most senior priests in the Isis hierarchy. The rituals performed at Philae were the most ancient and the most authentic. The statue of Isis at Philae was the most sacred image of the goddess in the world, and the island itself, surrounded by the waters of the Nile, at the point where the river emerged from the underworld, facing the island where Osiris was buried, was the most sacred site in the Isis geography. This centrality gave Philae an importance that far exceeded its physical size. The island was small. The temple was modest by Egyptian standards, nothing like the colossal complexes at Karnak or Edfu. But its spiritual authority was immense. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean world to worship at Philae. Delegations from Isis temples in Rome, Athens, Corinth, and North Africa visited the island to consult with the priests, to receive authoritative rulings on liturgical questions, and to carry home sacred objects, amulets, figurines, vials of Nile water that had been blessed at the mother temple. The traffic was continuous, the island was a hub, and the centrality of Philae within the Isis network explains, in part, why the temple survived so long. It was not merely a local cult center, it was the international headquarters of a global religion. The architectural layout of the temple complex reflects this international character. The complex includes not only the main temple of Isis, but also smaller temples dedicated to other deities: Hathor, Horus, Harindotes, Mandulis, Imhotep, each one serving a specific constituency within the diverse community of Philae worshippers. The Temple of Hathor, built by Ptolemy VI and expanded by Augustus, contained relief scenes of music and dancing that celebrated the goddess's role as the patron of joy, beauty, and fertility. The Chapel of Mandulis, the Nubian sun god, served the Blemii and Nobatai worshippers who formed the temple's most devoted and most politically important constituency. The Kiosk of Trajan served as a ceremonial gateway for the arrival of the sacred bark from the Nile. Each structure had its own function, its own constituency, its own liturgical program. Together, they formed a campus, a multi-temple complex that served the diverse religious needs of an international community of worshippers. The artistic quality of the reliefs at Philae is exceptionally high, rivaling the best work at Edfu and Dendera. The Ptolemaic and Roman builders employed Egyptian craftsmen of the first rank, who carved the traditional scenes: the pharaoh offering to the gods, the divine birth of Horus, the triumph of order over chaos, with a precision and a refinement that reflects the continued vitality of the Egyptian artistic tradition even under foreign rule. The reliefs at Philae are not the work of a dying culture. They are the work of a living one. A culture that was adapting to new political realities while maintaining its artistic standards, its theological traditions, and its institutional integrity. The Mamisi, the birthhouse, at Philae is one of the finest examples of this architectural type in Egypt. The Mamisi was dedicated to the divine birth of Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris, conceived after Osiris's death through the magical power of Isis. The reliefs depict the full cycle of divine conception, pregnancy, and birth. Isis nursing the infant Horus in the papyrus marshes, protecting him from the agents of Seth, raising him in secret until he was old enough to claim his father's throne. The scenes are both mythological and theological. They tell a story, but the story is also an argument. The argument is that kingship is divine, that the pharaoh is the living Horus, that the institution of kingship is sustained by the same magical power that brought Horus into the world. The Mamisi is not merely a chapel, it is a constitutional document, a visual assertion of the divine right of kings, carved in stone on the walls of the goddess's own temple. The core problem of Philae is the problem of survival, not the survival of the building, which has been secured by the UNESCO relocation, but the survival of the religion. Why did the Temple of Isis at Philae continue to function for more than a century after every other pagan temple in the Roman Empire had been closed? Why did the worship of Isis endure at this remote island on the southern frontier of Egypt when it had been extinguished everywhere else? And what does the temple's extraordinary longevity tell us about the nature of religious persistence and the limits of imperial power? The story begins with the Emperor Theodosius I. In 391 and 392 of the Common Era, Theodosius issued a series of edicts that made pagan worship illegal throughout the Roman Empire. Temples were closed, sacrifices were banned, the property of pagan cults was confiscated, the priesthoods were dissolved, the old gods, the gods of Greece and Rome, the gods of Egypt and Syria, the gods that had been worshipped for millennia, were by imperial decree extinguished. Christianity was the only legal religion. The conversion of the empire was complete, except at Philae. At Philae, the Temple of Isis remained open. The priests continued their daily rituals. The offerings were made. The hymns were chanted. The sacred falcon, the living embodiment of Horus, kept in the temple precinct and venerated as a divine animal, continued to be fed and honored. The worship of the old gods continued, in defiance of imperial law, for nearly a century and a half after Theodosius decreed its end. How was this possible? The answer lies in the border. Philae sat at the frontier between the Roman Empire and the territories of two Nubian tribal confederations, the Blemmyes and the Nobatae. The Blemmyes, who inhabited the eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, and the Nobatae, who controlled the territory immediately south of the First Cataract, were both worshippers of Isis. They revered the temple at Philae as the most sacred site in their religious landscape. They made annual pilgrimages to the island. They participated in the festivals. They borrowed the sacred statue of Isis from the temple and carried it to their own lands for oracular consultation. And they were prepared to fight to maintain their access to the temple. The Roman authorities, who were responsible for defending the southern frontier against exactly these kinds of tribal incursions, made a pragmatic calculation. Closing the Temple of Isis at Philae would have enraged the Blemmyes and the Nobatae, destabilizing the frontier and potentially provoking a military conflict that the empire could ill afford. The cost of keeping the temple open, tolerating a small pocket of paganism on a remote island at the edge of the empire, was vastly less than the cost of suppressing it, and so the temple remained open. The imperial edicts were, at Philae, quietly ignored. But here's the problem. The imperial authorities did not merely tolerate Philae's paganism, they formalized it. In the 5th century, a treaty was negotiated between the Roman government and the Blemmyes and Nobatae that explicitly guaranteed the tribe's right to visit the Temple of Isis. The treaty allowed the tribal priests to enter the temple, to participate in the rituals, to borrow the sacred statue of Isis, and to carry it across the frontier into their own territories for a fixed period before returning it. The treaty was a diplomatic agreement, a formal, written, legally binding contract between the Christian Roman Empire and two pagan tribal confederations, guaranteeing the continuation of pagan worship at a specific temple on a specific island. This is extraordinary. A century after Theodosius had banned pagan worship throughout the empire, the imperial government was signing treaties that protected it. A contradiction between the law, which prohibited pagan worship, and the treaty, which guaranteed it, is a vivid illustration of the gap between imperial ideology and imperial practice. The empire claimed to be Christian. The empire's frontier policy required the maintenance of a pagan temple, and the gap between the two, between what the empire said and what the empire did, was the space in which the Temple of Isis continued to function. And it gets worse. The worship at Philae was not a marginal, attenuated, barely surviving remnant of the old religion. It was active, vigorous, and institutionally robust. The temple maintained a full complement of priests. The daily rituals were performed according to the ancient prescriptions. The annual festivals, including the Festival of Isis, which attracted pilgrims from across Nubia, were celebrated with music, processions, and public feasting. The temple was, by any measure, a functioning religious institution, staffed, funded, and frequented by worshippers who had not received the Christian memo. The last hieroglyphic inscription, Esmet Akom's dedication of 394, is a snapshot of this functioning institution. Esmet Akom was not a solitary holdout, carving graffiti on a ruined wall. He was a priest, a member of a priestly family that had served the temple for generations. His inscription is a formal religious text, a dedication to a god, carved in the traditional manner, using the traditional script, following the traditional formulae. The fact that the script is hieroglyphic, the most formal, most conservative, most deliberately archaic of Egyptian writing systems, tells us that Esmet Akom was self-consciously maintaining a tradition. He knew that hieroglyphic writing was ancient. He knew that the world outside Philae had moved on, and he carved his inscription anyway, in the old script, in the old language, in the old way, because the old way was the right way, and the temple at Philae was the last place on earth where the old way still mattered. The last demotic inscription at Philae dates to 452 of the Common Era, 58 years after Esmet Akom's hieroglyphic dedication. This means that at least some form of Egyptian language temple inscription continued at Philae for nearly 6 decades after the last hieroglyph was carved. The language was dying, but it was dying slowly, retreating from the formal hieroglyphic script to the more accessible demotic, shrinking from public inscription to private notation, contracting from a national language to a temple dialect. The death of Egyptian writing was not a sudden event. It was a process, a long, gradual, painful contraction, documented in the inscriptions of a single temple on a single island at the southern edge of the known world. And the temple's final closure was not a peaceful transition. In 535 to 537 of the Common Era, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I ordered the temple shut. The closure was enforced by a general named Narses, who arrived on the island with soldiers, imprisoned the remaining priests, seized the sacred statues, and shipped them to Constantinople. The sacred falcon, the living Horus, the bird that had been venerated in the temple precinct for centuries, was, according to a later Coptic account, killed by a Christian bishop named Macedonius, who gained access to the bird and burned it. The closure was brutal. The imprisonment of the priests, the seizure of the statues, the killing of the sacred falcon, the conversion of the temple into a Christian church, with Coptic crosses carved over the pharaonic reliefs, Christian altars placed before Egyptian sanctuaries, the faces of the gods chiseled from the walls. The last functioning Egyptian temple did not close voluntarily. It was closed by force, by an emperor 1,000 miles away, by soldiers who carried out his orders, by a bishop who killed a bird, and then the silence fell. The silence that had been approaching for a century and a half. The silence that Esmet Akom had been trying to forestall with his last hieroglyph, finally arrived. The hymns stopped, the offerings ceased, the daily ritual was not performed, and the temple, which had been a living institution for more than 700 years, became a ruin, a beautiful ruin, an atmospheric ruin, a ruin on an island in the Nile, surrounded by the sound of the cataract, facing the island where Osiris was buried, dedicated to the goddess who had brought her husband back from the dead, but who could not, in the end, bring her own temple back from closure. The Blemies and the Nobatai, the two tribal confederations whose worship of Isis sustained the Temple of Philae for more than a century after the Christian closure of all other Egyptian temples, are among the most fascinating and least understood peoples in the late antique history of the Nile Valley. The Blemies were a semi-nomadic people who inhabited the eastern desert of Egypt between the Nile and the Red Sea. They are mentioned in Egyptian texts from the New Kingdom onward as raiders, traders, and occasional allies of the Egyptian state. By the late Roman period, they had developed a sophisticated military organization and were capable of mounting serious challenges to Roman control of the upper Egyptian frontier. The Nobatai, also known as the Nubades, were a settled agricultural people who controlled the territory immediately south of the First Cataract. They had been invited into the region by the Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century to serve as a buffer against the Blemies, a classic imperial strategy of using one tribal group to control another. The Nobatai eventually converted to Christianity in the 6th century, becoming one of the earliest Christian kingdoms in Africa. But before their conversion, they were devoted worshippers of Isis, and their access to the Temple of Philae was a matter of the highest diplomatic importance. The treaty between the Roman government and the Blemmyes and Nobatae, negotiated in the 5th century, is one of the most unusual diplomatic agreements in Roman history. The treaty allowed the tribal priests to enter the Temple of Isis, to participate in the rituals, and to borrow the sacred statue of Isis for oracular consultation. The statue was taken from the temple, transported to the tribal territories, and kept there for a fixed period, during which the tribal leaders would consult the goddess on matters of war, peace, agriculture, and divine favor. After the consultation period, the statue was returned to the temple, carried back across the frontier by the tribal priests, escorted by guards, received by the Egyptian priesthood with ceremony and relief. This practice, the lending of a temple's cult statue to a foreign tribal confederation, has no parallel in the history of Roman-Egyptian relations. It represents a remarkable concession by the imperial authorities, an acknowledgement that the religious needs of the frontier tribes took precedence over the imperial policy of Christian uniformity. The concession was made for pragmatic reasons. The Blemmyes and the Nobatae were dangerous enemies when provoked, and the cost of a military campaign against them far exceeded the cost of keeping the Temple of Isis open. But the concession also reflects a deeper reality about the limits of imperial power. The emperor could decree the closure of every temple in the empire, but the emperor could not enforce the decree at the frontier. The frontier was too remote, the tribes were too powerful, the god, in this case, the goddess, was too important to the people who lived beyond the reach of imperial law, and the goddess was important. The worship of Isis by the Blemmyes and the Nobatae was not a casual or superficial attachment. It was a deep structural element of their cultural identity. The tribal priests were specialists, men who had been trained in the Egyptian ritual tradition, who could read demotic script, if not hieroglyphs, who understood the liturgical calendar, and who were capable of performing the rituals required by the goddess's cult. The tribal pilgrims who visited Philae annually were not tourists. They were devotees. Men and women who had travelled hundreds of kilometers through the desert to worship at the most sacred site of their religion. The worship of Isis was the bond that held the tribal confederations together, a shared religious commitment that transcended tribal divisions and that provided a common identity for peoples who were otherwise divided by language, territory, and political allegiance. When Justinian closed the temple in 535 to 537, the impact on the Blemmyes and the Nobatae was devastating. Their religious centre was destroyed, their priests were imprisoned, their sacred statue was seized, and their cultural identity, bound up with the worship of Isis at Philae, was undermined. The Nobatae, who were already in contact with Christian missionaries, eventually converted to Christianity in the 6th century. The Blemmyes, more resistant to conversion, continued to practice their traditional religion in increasingly marginalized forms for several more centuries before they too were absorbed into the Christian and later Islamic world of the Nile Valley. The closure of Philae was not merely the end of a temple. It was the end of a cultural system, a system that had linked Egypt and Nubia, that had provided a shared religious identity for diverse peoples, that had sustained a priestly tradition across linguistic and ethnic boundaries, and that had demonstrated, for more than a century, the capacity of a religious institution to outlast the political structures that surrounded it. The Temple of Isis at Philae was not merely a building. It was a node, a point of connection in a network of relationships that stretched from the Roman court in Constantinople to the tribal camps of the eastern desert. When the node was destroyed, the network collapsed, and the peoples who had depended on the network, the priests, the pilgrims, the tribal leaders, were left without a center, without a shared identity, without the institution that had held them together. The story of Philae's survival and closure is, in microcosm, the story of the end of the ancient world, the story of how a global civilization built on shared religious practices and shared sacred sites was replaced by a new civilization built on different principles. The replacement was not sudden. It was gradual, a slow, uneven process that played out differently in different regions, at different speeds, with different degrees of violence and accommodation. At Philae, the replacement took a century and a half, from Theodosius's decree in 391 to Justinian's closure in 535. During that century and a half, the old and the new coexisted. Christian churches standing beside pagan temples, Christian crosses carved into pharaonic walls, Christian bishops and pagan priests inhabiting the same island, worshipping different gods in different buildings, sharing the same water and the same sunlight and the same view of the island where Osiris lay buried. The coexistence was not peaceful. It was tense, competitive, and sometimes violent. The Christian sources describe the pagans of Philae with hostility, as barbarians, as idol worshippers, as enemies of the true faith. The pagan sources, what little survives of them, describe the Christians with equal hostility. The two communities lived side by side but not together. They shared an island but not a world. And when the balance of power finally shifted, when the imperial government decided that the cost of tolerating Philae's paganism outweighed the cost of suppressing it, the old world was destroyed. With the efficiency and the brutality that characterized late Roman imperial administration, the physical layout of the Philae temple complex is unusual among Egyptian temples in several respects. Most Egyptian temples are oriented on an east-west axis, with the entrance facing east toward the rising sun. The Temple of Isis at Philae is oriented roughly north-south, with the entrance facing south, toward Nubia, toward the tribal territories of the Blemmyes and the Nobatae, toward the upper reaches of the Nile, where the river emerged from the African interior. This southern orientation is unique among major Egyptian temples and reflects the temple's frontier location and its special relationship with the peoples of the south. The approach to the temple from the south, through the outer colonnade, past the western colonnade with its varied and unfinished capitals, to the first pylon, creates a processional experience that is longer and more gradual than the approach to most Egyptian temples. The colonnade stretches for roughly 90 meters along the western shore of the island, its columns creating a covered walkway that frames views of the Nile and the surrounding islands. The colonnade was built by multiple rulers. Some columns bear the cartouches of Augustus, others of Tiberius. Others are unfinished and bear no inscription at all. The mixture of complete and incomplete columns gives the colonnade a distinctive character, a sense of ongoing work, of continuous construction, of a building that was always being added to and never quite finished. The first pylon of the Temple of Isis is decorated with relief scenes that follow the standard Egyptian formula. The pharaoh smiting enemies before the gods, the pharaoh making offerings, the pharaoh receiving divine blessing. The reliefs are conventional in composition but distinctive in execution. The Ptolemaic carving style is more detailed, more deeply cut, and more precisely finished than most pharaonic work. The pylon is flanked by two granite lions and by two obelisks, both now lost, that originally marked the entrance to the sacred precinct. Beyond the first pylon lies the forecourt, containing the Mamesi and the colonnade of the birthhouse. The forecourt is a transitional space, public enough to admit festival crowds, private enough to contain the rituals of the divine birth. The Mamesi columns, with their composite floral capitals and their biers figures, create an atmosphere that is both festive and protective, the joy of divine birth guarded by the apotropaic power of the dwarf god. The second pylon, smaller than the first, leads to the hypostyle hall, a dark, enclosed space of 10 columns that serves as the antechamber to the sanctuary. The transition from the bright, open forecourt to the dim, enclosed hall is dramatic and deliberate, a physical enactment of the transition from the profane to the sacred, from the world of light to the world of divine darkness. The columns of the hypostyle hall are shorter and thicker than those of the colonnade, designed not for elegance but for strength, supporting a heavy stone roof that admits no natural light. The sanctuary complex beyond the hypostyle hall consists of a series of small, interconnected chambers, the Hall of Offerings, the sanctuary proper, and a suite of side rooms dedicated to specific ritual functions. The sanctuary is the smallest and darkest room in the temple, a space roughly 3 meters by 4 meters, its walls covered with ritual texts and offering scenes, its ceiling low, its atmosphere dense, with the weight of accumulated sanctity. This is where the statue of Isis stood. This is where the daily ritual was performed. This is where Esmet Akom and his predecessors served the goddess every morning for centuries, in darkness, in silence, in the intimate solitude of a priest alone with his god. The side chambers surrounding the sanctuary served specific functions within the ritual program. One chamber was dedicated to the mythology of Osiris, its walls decorated with scenes of the god's death, dismemberment, and resurrection. Another chamber contained the sacred well, the source of the purified water used in the daily ritual. A third chamber served as a treasury, a secure room where the temple's most valuable ritual objects were stored between ceremonies. Each chamber is small, dark, and richly decorated, a miniature world within the larger world of the temple, each one dedicated to a specific aspect of the temple's theological program. The roof of the temple, accessible by a staircase from the hypostyle hall, was used for specific astronomical rituals, most notably the annual observation of the rising of the star Sirius, the Sothic rising, which marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year. The observation was conducted from the roof at dawn, and the first sighting of Sirius above the horizon was the signal for the beginning of the New Year festivals. The roof at Philae, like the roof at Edfu and Dendera, served as an observatory, a platform from which the priests monitored the movements of the stars and calculated the timing of their ritual program. The island setting of Philae added a dimension to the temple's sacred geography that no mainland temple could match. The temple was surrounded by water. The sound of the cataract, the rushing, roaring, thundering sound of the Nile passing through the first cataract rapids, was a constant presence, audible from every part of the island. The sound was not merely environmental, it was theological. The sound of the primordial waters, the sound of the ocean from which the first land had emerged, the sound of chaos held at bay by the ordered walls of the temple. The temple was an island of order in a sea of chaos, and the sound of the water, the sound of chaos pressing against the walls of order, was the acoustic backdrop to every ritual, every prayer, every hymn that the priests of Isis performed. This acoustic dimension is lost in the relocated temple. Agilkia Island sits in the calm waters of Lake Nasser, behind the high dam. There are no cataracts, there are no rapids, there is no thundering water. The sound that defined the original Philae, the constant, overwhelming, primordial roar of the Nile passing through the first cataract, is absent. The relocated temple has its stones, it has its inscriptions, it has its columns and its pylons and its sanctuary, but it does not have its sound. And the absence of the sound is, for the sensitive visitor, the most palpable loss of the relocation. The gap between the temple as it was and the temple as it is, measured not in meters but in decibels. The mythology inscribed on the walls of Philae tells the central story of Egyptian religion, the story of Isis and Osiris, of death and resurrection, of the goddess who loved so fiercely that she defied the laws of the universe to bring her husband back from the dead. The myth exists in multiple versions. The earliest fragments date to the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, and the most complete narrative is the Greek account by Plutarch, written in the 1st century of the Common Era. But the version inscribed at Philae has its own distinctive features, details and episodes that are not found elsewhere, emphases that reflect the specific theological concerns of the Ptolemaic priesthood, and a narrative structure that is designed to be read in the specific architectural context of the temple. The story begins with Osiris, the good king, the civilizer, the god who taught humanity the arts of agriculture, law, and religion. Seth, Osiris's brother, is jealous. He conspires against Osiris. He builds a beautiful chest, decorated with gold and precious stones, and offers it as a gift at a banquet. The chest is exactly the size of Osiris's body. Seth has secretly taken Osiris's measurements. When Osiris lies down in the chest, Seth slams the lid shut, seals it with molten lead, and throws it into the Nile. Osiris drowns. The chest floats downriver and comes to rest at Byblos, on the Phoenician coast, where it is engulfed by a great tree that grows around it. Isis, devastated by her husband's death, begins her search. She travels to Byblos, she finds the tree, she recovers the chest, she brings the body back to Egypt, but Seth discovers the body and in a frenzy of destruction dismembers it. cutting Osiris into 14 pieces or 42 in some versions and scattering them across Egypt. Isis, undeterred, searches for every piece. She finds 13 of the 14. The 14th, the phallus, has been eaten by a fish. She reassembles the body. She wraps it in linen. And then, using her magical power, she breathes life back into Osiris, sufficiently at least to conceive a son. The son is Horus, who will avenge his father and claim the throne of Egypt. The myth is inscribed on the walls of the Osiris chambers at Philae, small rooms above the main sanctuary, accessible by a staircase, dedicated to the god whose body lies buried on the neighbouring island of Bigay. The reliefs show the full cycle: the death, the search, the reassembly, the magical resurrection, the conception of Horus. The scenes are deeply moving. Isis bending over the reassembled body of her husband, her wings spread in a gesture of protection and magical power, her face expressing a grief that is simultaneously human and divine. The resurrection of Osiris is not a full resurrection in the Christian sense. Osiris does not return to the world of the living. He becomes the ruler of the world of the dead, the king of the underworld, the judge of souls, the god who determines the fate of every human being after death. His kingdom is the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, a realm of darkness and danger through which the soul must pass in order to reach the blessed afterlife. Osiris sits on his throne in the Hall of Judgment, watching as each soul's heart is weighed against the feather of Mat, the feather of truth, of justice, of cosmic order. If the heart is light, if the soul has lived a just life, it is admitted to the eternal paradise of the field of reeds. If the heart is heavy, if the soul has lived unjustly, it is devoured by Amit, the eater of the dead, and the soul ceases to exist. This mythology, the death of the good king, the search of the grieving wife, the magical resurrection, the birth of the divine son, the judgment of the dead, is the theological framework within which the Temple of Philae operated. Every ritual performed in the temple was, in some sense, a reenactment of the myth. The daily service of Isis, the washing, the anointing, the dressing of the sacred statue, was a reenactment of Isis's care for the body of Osiris. The festival of the divine birth was a reenactment of the conception and birth of Horus. The annual processions to the island of Bigay were reenactments of Isis's journey to tend the burial of her husband. The temple was the myth, made architectural. The sanctuary was the chamber where Isis mourned. The Mamisi was the marsh where Horus was born. The forecourt was the gathering place where the faithful celebrated the goddess's triumph over death. And the island itself, surrounded by the waters of the Nile, facing the island where Osiris lay buried, was the mythological landscape, rendered in physical form, containing within its shores the entire narrative of death, love, magic, and resurrection that sustained Egyptian religion for 3 millennia. The relationship between Philae and Bigay, the temple of the living goddess, and the tomb of the dead god, was the spatial embodiment of the myth. The two islands were visible to each other across the narrow channel. The priests of Isis could see Bigay from the temple roof. The ceremonies at Philae were directed toward Bigay. The prayers were addressed to the dead god across the water. The offerings were presented in the direction of his burial. The rituals were oriented toward the island where he lay. The entire theological program of Philae was a conversation across a channel of water. Isis speaking to Osiris, the living to the dead, the goddess of magic to the god of the underworld. And the conversation, like the last hieroglyph, has ended. The channel is drowned. Bigay is submerged. The view from Philae to the burial place of Osiris is obscured by the waters of Lake Nasser, and the temple, relocated, reconstructed, preserved on Agilkia, continues its rituals for no one, continues its conversation with a god who is no longer visible, continues its mourning across a channel that no longer exists. The silence of Philae is not the silence of abandonment. It is the silence of continuation without response. The temple still speaks. Its walls still bear the inscriptions. Its reliefs still depict the myth. Its architecture still embodies the narrative of death and resurrection. But the god does not answer. The island does not respond. And the conversation that sustained the temple for 7 centuries, the dialogue between the living and the dead, between Isis and Osiris, between hope and grief, has become a monologue. The goddess speaks, no one replies, and the temple, on its new island, in its calm waters, without the roar of the cataracts, and without the sight of Bigge, holds the monologue in its stones, and waits for an answer that will never come. Walk through the Temple of Philae as it stands today, not on its original island, which is now submerged beneath Lake Nasser, but on Agilkia, the neighbouring island to which the entire complex was relocated between 1972 and 1980. Approach by boat. This is the only way to reach the temple, a short motorboat ride from the marina near the Aswan Low Dam. The approach by water is part of the experience. The temple rises from the island gradually as the boat draws closer. First tops of the columns, then the pylon, then the full facade, emerging from the green vegetation of the island against the blue of the water and the brown of the surrounding desert hills. The effect is theatrical, a building appearing from nowhere, an island temple materializing on the water like a mirage that turns out to be real. The approach replicates, intentionally, the original experience of arriving at Philae. The ancient temple was reached by boat, pilgrims, priests, and officials arriving from the Nile, navigating the channels between the cataract rocks, seeing the temple grow on the horizon as their boats drew near. The water approach was not merely practical, it was liturgical. The journey across the sacred waters, past the island of Bigge where Osiris lay buried, to the island of Isis where the goddess mourned and worked her magic. The boat ride was a crossing, from the ordinary world to the sacred, from the known to the mysterious, from the land of the living to the threshold of the dead. Step onto the island and walk along the outer courtyard, a long colonnaded approach that runs parallel to the western shore. The colonnade is irregular. The columns are of different heights, different styles, different periods. Some are unfinished, their capitals roughed out but never detailed. This irregularity, unusual in Egyptian temple architecture, reflects the extended construction history of the complex. Columns begun under one king and left unfinished when his reign ended, completed or modified by his successor, each one bearing the marks of its own particular moment in the temple's history. At the end of the colonnade, the great pylon of the Temple of Isis rises before you, 18 meters high, decorated with colossal relief scenes showing Ptolemy XII and other rulers smiting enemies and making offerings to the gods. The pylon is the temple's public face, the boundary between the outer world and the inner, the threshold that separates the profane from the sacred. Pass through the gateway and enter the forecourt. The forecourt contains the Mamizai, the birth house, a small freestanding temple dedicated to the divine birth of Horus. The Mamisi at Philae is one of the best preserved in Egypt, and its reliefs depict, in vivid detail, the conception, birth, and nursing of the infant Horus by his mother Isis. The scenes are both theological and tender, a goddess nursing her child, a mother protecting her son from the forces that seek to destroy him. The Mamisi was the setting for the annual festival of the divine birth, a celebration of Horus's arrival in the world, of the triumph of life over death, of the goddess's magical power to create and sustain. Beyond the forecourt, pass through the second pylon, smaller than the first but equally decorated, and enter the hypostyle hall. The hall is supported by 10 columns, their capitals carved with elaborate floral compositions in the Ptolemaic style. The ceiling, once painted with astronomical scenes, retains traces of its original decoration. Stars, vultures, and the spread wings of the sky goddess Nut, whose body arched across the heavens and whose belly was the vault of the sky. The walls of the hypostyle hall are covered with ritual scenes, the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, the priests performing the daily service, the sacred vessels being carried in procession. The reliefs are damaged in many areas. The Christian conversion left its mark, with the faces of the gods chipped away and Coptic crosses carved into the stone. But enough survives to give a clear picture of the ritual program that governed the temple's daily operations. Beyond the hypostyle hall, a series of smaller rooms, vestibules, storerooms, and ritual preparation chambers lead to the sanctuary. The sanctuary is small, dark, and austere, a simple stone chamber that once held the sacred statue of Isis. The statue is gone, seized by Narcissus' soldiers in 535 and shipped to Constantinople, where it has been lost. The room is empty, but it is not silent. The walls still speak, the inscriptions that describe the daily ritual, the hymns to Isis, the prayers for the dead, the magical formulae that the priests recited in the darkness. The words are still there. The voice is gone. The kiosk of Trajan, located on the eastern shore of the island, is the most photographed structure at Philae, and one of the most recognizable images in Egyptian archaeology. The kiosk is a rectangular, open-sided pavilion of 14 columns, each one topped with elaborate floral capitals, supporting architraves that once held a wooden roof. The structure was built by the Roman Emperor Trajan around 100 of the Common Era as a ceremonial gateway for the arrival of the sacred bark of Isis from the Nile. The bark would be brought to the island by boat, carried ashore through the kiosk, and processed along the colonnade to the main temple. The kiosk was the threshold, the point of arrival, the place where the goddess first touched the sacred ground of her island. The kiosk columns are unfinished. The relief decoration that was planned for their surfaces was never completed. The blank columns, standing against the sky, have an austere beauty that the finished decoration might actually have diminished. The kiosk has become iconic precisely because of its incompleteness. A building that was interrupted, that was left in a state of permanent becoming, that represents not the finished achievement, but the ongoing aspiration of the temple's builders. The relocation of Philae was, in several respects, more complex than the relocation of Abu Simbel, which had been completed a decade earlier. Abu Simbel was a rock-cut temple, carved from a cliff face, its components large and geometrically regular. Philae was a built temple, constructed from individual blocks of sandstone, its components numerous and varied. Abu Simbel required the cutting of the cliff into large blocks and their reassembly at a new site. Philae required the dismantling of an entire island's worth of structures, temples, colonnades, gateways, stairways, walls, into individual stones, their transport across water, and their precise reassembly on a different island. The numbers tell the story. Abu Simbel was cut into 1,042 blocks. Philae was dismantled into approximately 40,000 stones. Abu Simbel weighed roughly 20,000 tons. Philae weighed approximately 27,000 tons. The Abu Simbel operation took 4 years. The Philae operation took 8. The Philae project was, by every quantitative measure, a larger and more complex undertaking than the Abu Simbel rescue, and yet it has received far less public attention, perhaps because the drama of cutting a temple from a cliff is more visually compelling than the patient labour of numbering and moving 40,000 individual stones. The preparation of Agilkia Island was itself a major engineering project. The island, which was smaller and lower than the original Philae, had to be reshaped to accommodate the temple complex. The top of the island was levelled. The sides were reinforced with retaining walls. The landscaping was designed to approximate the appearance of the original Philae, its gentle slopes, its rocky outcrops, its vegetation patterns. The goal was not merely to relocate the temple, but to relocate its context. To recreate, as faithfully as possible, the physical environment in which the temple had originally stood. The recreation was not perfect. Agilkia is a different island. Its orientation is slightly different. Its relationship to the surrounding water is different. And the island of Bigay, the burial place of Osiris, which was visible from the original Philae across a narrow channel, is no longer visible from the relocated temple in the same way. The theological geography of Philae, the sightlines, the water channels, the spatial relationships that connected the temple of the living goddess to the tomb of the dead god, has been altered by the relocation. The temple stands. The theology has shifted. The flooding that preceded the relocation had already caused significant damage. The first Aswan Dam, completed in 1902, partially submerged Philae for several months each year, raising the water level to a height that covered the lower portions of the temple complex and deposited layers of silt on the carved surfaces. The annual flooding continued for more than 60 years, from 1902 until the coffer dam was built around the island in the early 1970s as part of the relocation project. During those 60 years, the temple was subjected to repeated cycles of submersion and exposure. Cycles that deposited mineral salts in the porous sandstone caused the carved surfaces to deteriorate and washed away much of the original painted decoration. The damage from the flooding is still visible on the relocated temple. The lower portions of the walls and columns show a distinctive grey discoloration, a band of colour change that marks the high water line of the annual flood. Below the line, the stone is grey, pitted, and salt damaged. Above the line, the stone retains its original warm sandstone colour. The boundary between the two zones is sharp and horizontal, a watermark. 1,500 years of flooding compressed into a single visible line on the surface of the stone. The line tells the story of the temple's modern ordeal. The decades of annual submersion that preceded the relocation, the slow chemical warfare of water and salt against sandstone, the gradual deterioration of surfaces that had survived intact for 2,000 years. The relocation arrested the deterioration. The temple on Agilkia is above the waterline of Lake Nasser, permanently, safely, irrecoverably above the water that threatened to destroy it. The annual flooding has ceased. The salt damage has stabilized. The surfaces, while permanently scarred by the decades of submersion, are no longer actively deteriorating. The relocation saved the temple from the lake. The question is whether it can save it from the future, from the tourism, the climate change, the rising water table, and the other forces that threaten every ancient monument in the modern Nile Valley. The modern visitor experience at Philae begins with the boat ride from the marina. The boats, small, noisy, colourful motorboats operated by local boatmen, depart from a dock near the Aswan Low Dam and cross the short stretch of water to Agilkia Island. The approach is from the south, the opposite direction from the ancient approach, which was from the north, downriver from the cataract. The change in approach direction is a consequence of the relocation. The reorientation of the temple on the new island placed the main entrance on the western side, accessible from the southern approach. The ancient pilgrim arrived from the north, passing the island of Bigay and seeing the temple rise from the water. The modern tourist arrives from the south, seeing the kiosk of Trajan first and the main temple second. The boat ride is short, 5 to 10 minutes, but it is essential to the experience. Philae is an island temple. It is defined by its relationship to the water, and the approach by boat, the gradual emergence of the columns and the pylons from the water's edge, the sense of crossing from the ordinary world to the sacred, is an experience that the relocated temple preserves, even if the specific geography has changed. The water is different water, the island is a different island, but the experience of arriving by boat at an island temple, of crossing a body of water to reach a place of worship, is the same experience that pilgrims have had at Philae for more than 2,000 years. The sound and light show that is performed at Philae in the evenings, a theatrical presentation that uses coloured lights, projected images, and recorded narration to tell the story of Isis and Osiris against the backdrop of the illuminated temple, is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Aswan. The show is theatrical, dramatic, and emotionally effective. It uses the temple's architecture as a stage set, the columns and the pylons becoming characters in the mythological narrative, the darkness of the Nile becoming the darkness of the underworld, the rising light becoming the resurrection of Osiris. The show is not archaeology, it is not history, it is entertainment, a modern retelling of an ancient myth performed in the temple, where the myth was once believed to be literally true. The worship of Isis at Philae connects to one of the most significant religious transformations in the history of the ancient world, the transition from polytheism to monotheism. In the centuries before the Christian closure, the cult of Isis had been evolving in a direction that anticipated, and may have influenced, the development of early Christianity. Isis was worshipped as a universal goddess, a deity who encompassed all other goddesses, who absorbed their attributes, who transcended the boundaries of individual cults and individual nations. The ancient texts at Philae include hymns in which Isis declares, "I am all that has been, that is, and that shall be." This is not polytheism. This is henotheism at the very least, the elevation of a single deity to a position of cosmic supremacy, the subordination of all other gods to one. The parallels between the Isis cult and early Christianity have been noted by scholars since the early 20th century. Both religions centered on a divine mother who bore a divine son. Both involved a narrative of death and resurrection. Both promised their followers salvation, the defeat of death, the continuation of life beyond the grave. Both attracted followers from across the social spectrum, rich and poor, slave and free, men and women, and both spread across the Roman Empire with remarkable speed, competing for the same converts, addressing the same spiritual needs, offering the same fundamental promise, that death was not the end. The comparison is not an argument for direct influence. The question of whether early Christianity borrowed specific elements from the Isis cult is highly contested and probably unanswerable with the evidence currently available. But the structural parallels are striking, and they illuminate the religious landscape of the late Roman world. A landscape in which multiple religions were competing for adherents, each one offering a slightly different version of the same fundamental narrative. The triumph of Christianity over the Isis cults was not the triumph of a new idea over an old one. It was the triumph of one version of a widely shared idea over another version, and the Temple of Philae, the last outpost of the losing version, stands as a monument to the road not taken. If the Isis cult had triumphed, if the worship of the Great Mother had prevailed over the worship of the Father and the Son, the Temple of Philae might be, today, what St. Peter's Basilica is to Christianity. The Mother Church, the centre of the faith, the most sacred site in the world. The history of Western civilization might have developed along very different lines. The iconography of the Madonna and Child, the most ubiquitous image in Western art, might have remained the iconography of Isis and Horus. The theological concepts of resurrection, salvation, and eternal life might have been articulated in Egyptian rather than Greek terms. This is not speculation for its own sake. It is a reminder that the outcome of the religious transition of late antiquity was not inevitable. The triumph of Christianity over the Isis cult was the result of specific historical circumstances. The conversion of Constantine, the edicts of Theodosius, the military enforcement of Justinian. It was not the result of inherent superiority, theological, moral, or intellectual. The Isis cult was a sophisticated, humane, and spiritually satisfying religion that met the needs of millions of people across the Mediterranean world. Its defeat was political, not philosophical, and the Temple of Philae, standing on its island in the Nile, is the physical evidence of that political defeat. The building where the losing religion made its last stand. The Isis cult continued in attenuated form after the closure of Philae. The goddess was absorbed into the Coptic Christian tradition, her imagery, her attributes, her maternal symbolism reappearing in the iconography of the Virgin Mary. The seated Isis, nursing the infant Horus, became the seated Mary, nursing the infant Jesus. The blue mantle of Isis became the blue mantle of Mary. The star of Isis, the star Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, whose rising marked the Egyptian New Year, became the Star of Bethlehem, the celestial sign of the divine birth. The transition was not acknowledged, it was not conscious, but it was real, a subterranean continuity between the last goddess of Egypt and the most venerated woman in Christianity. The Temple of Philae, then, is not merely the end of a religion, it is the beginning of a transformation. A transformation that carried the imagery, the symbolism, and the spiritual vocabulary of the Isis cult into the new religion that replaced it. The goddess died, her image lived on, and the temple where she was last worshipped. The building where her priests performed her rituals for the last time, before the soldiers came and the sacred falcon was killed and the statues were shipped to Constantinople, is the monument where the old world and the new world met, overlapped, and, in ways that neither fully understood, merged. The modern visitor to Philae sees both worlds. The pharaonic reliefs on the walls depict the old world, the gods, the rituals, the offerings, the mythological narratives that sustained Egyptian religion for 3 millennia. The Coptic crosses carved over the pharaonic reliefs represent the new world, the Christian faith that replaced the old, that defaced the old images, that built its altars in the old sanctuaries. The two worlds coexist on the same walls, they share the same stone, and the visitor, reading both, the hieroglyphs and the crosses, the old gods and the new, is witnessing, in the most physical possible form, the moment when one civilization ended and another began. Esmet Akum, or Nesmetrakum, as his name is sometimes transliterated, belonged to a family of priests who had served the temple of Isis at Philae for generations. The family's genealogy can be partially reconstructed from inscriptions on the temple walls and from graffiti in the surrounding area. Esmet Akhom was not the first member of his family to carve an inscription at Philae, and his inscription was not, as far as we can tell, intended to be the last. He was performing a routine act of priestly devotion, dedicating a carved figure to the god Manjulis, a Nubian solar deity, who was worshipped at Philae alongside the Egyptian gods. The inscription was professional, formulaic, and unremarkable. It followed the conventions of Ptolemaic temple dedications that had been in use for centuries. What makes the inscription remarkable is not its content but its context. Esmet Akhom carved his dedication on August 24, 394, less than 3 years after the Emperor Theodosius had issued his edicts banning pagan worship throughout the Roman Empire. The decree was law. The temples were supposed to be closed. The priesthoods were supposed to be dissolved. And yet, here was Esmet Akhom, standing before the gate of the Temple of Isis, chisel in hand, carving a dedication to a Nubian sun god in hieroglyphic script, as if nothing had changed, as if the empire had not decreed the death of his religion, as if the world was still the world he had been trained to serve. The inscription is written in both hieroglyphic and demotic scripts, a bilingual dedication that reflects the dual script tradition of the Ptolemaic period. The hieroglyphic portion is brief and formulaic, a standard offering text. The demotic portion adds the date, the birthday of Osiris, in the 110th year of Diocletian. This dating system, based on the era of the Emperor Diocletian, was standard in late antique Egypt and would later be adopted by the Coptic Christian Church as the basis for its own calendar. The irony is thick. The date of the last hieroglyphic inscription is expressed in a system that was invented by a Roman emperor and that would be perpetuated by the Christian Church that destroyed the religion that the inscription served. By Esmet Akhom's time, it is likely that the ability to read hieroglyphs did not extend far beyond his own family and the small community of priests who served the Temple of Isis. The hieroglyphic tradition, which had once employed thousands of scribes across Egypt, had contracted to a tiny remnant, a handful of specialists, clinging to a dying art, practicing their craft in a single temple on a single island at the southern edge of the known world. The tradition was alive, but it was on life support, and the machine that was keeping it alive, the Temple of Isis at Philae, with its daily rituals, its annual festivals, its priestly training program, was the last machine of its kind. When it stopped, the tradition would die. The tradition did die. Not immediately after Esmet Akhom's inscription, the temple continued to function for another century and a half, and demotic inscriptions continued to be carved until at least 452. But the hieroglyphic script, the most formal, most sacred, most deliberately archaic form of Egyptian writing, ceased with Esmet Akhom. After 394, no one carved another hieroglyph. The script that the Egyptians called the words of the gods, Medu Neter, fell silent, and when it fell silent, it fell completely. Within a generation or two, no one could read it. The last person on earth who could read hieroglyphs died, unnamed, unrecorded, sometime in the 5th century, on an island in the Nile, at the edge of the desert, in the shadow of a temple that was about to close. The death of the last hieroglyph reader is one of the most haunting moments in the history of human literacy. It is a moment that no text records, no inscription commemorates it, no historian mentions it. It happened in silence, the final failure of a tradition that had been sustained for 3.5 millennia, the last synapse firing in a cognitive network that had been transmitting knowledge since the earliest days of Egyptian civilization. One person, one mind, one death, and a writing system that had been used by millions of people across thousands of years was reduced to stone, beautiful, carved, polished, and unreadable. The stones still wait to be read. But the readers, the ones who could have read them without Champollion, without the Rosetta Stone, without the 2 centuries of scholarly labour that reconstructed the dead language from its fragments, those readers are gone. They died at Philae. They died with Esmet Akhom's family. They died in the silence that followed the last hieroglyph. And the silence at Philae is thicker and more final than at any other site in Egypt, because this is where it began. This is where the last word was spoken. This is where the voice of 3,500 years of Egyptian civilization said its last syllable, and then, without warning, without ceremony, without farewell, stopped. The math is striking. 3,500 years of continuous use. Tens of millions of individual hieroglyphs carved on the walls of thousands of temples, tombs, and monuments. Hundreds of thousands of papyri inscribed in hieratic and demotic scripts derived from the hieroglyphic system. An entire civilization's literary, religious, scientific, and administrative heritage encoded in a writing system of extraordinary beauty and complexity. And then, nothing. Silence. A single inscription on a gate at Philae, a priest named Esmet Akom, a date in August, and then no more hieroglyphs, ever. The loss is incalculable, the recovery is ongoing. And the temple, the building where the last word was carved, the place where the language died, the island where the voice of ancient Egypt fell silent, stands as the most eloquent monument to both, to the loss and to the recovery, to the silence that lasted 14 centuries, and to the reading that has been happening, slowly and patiently, and with increasing comprehension, ever since Champollion opened the door that Esmet Akom's generation was the last to walk through. The sacred falcon of Philae, the living bird that was kept in the temple precinct and venerated as the embodiment of Horus, represents one of the most distinctive and most disturbing aspects of the temple's religious practice. The keeping of sacred animals was a common feature of Egyptian temple culture. The Apis bull at Memphis, the sacred cats at Bubastis, the sacred crocodiles at Komombo. The animals were believed to be manifestations of the gods, not symbols, not metaphors, but actual physical embodiments of divine presence. The sacred falcon at Philae was Horus, the god himself incarnated in the body of a bird, living in the temple precinct, fed by the priests, venerated by the worshippers, consulted as an oracle. The killing of the sacred falcon by Bishop Macedonius, recounted in the 6th century Coptic life of Aaron, is one of the most symbolically violent moments in the history of the Christian conversion of Egypt. The bishop, according to the text, gained access to the temple under false pretenses and killed the bird, burning it, according to some versions of the account. The killing was not merely the destruction of an animal. It was the destruction of a god, the physical annihilation of the divine presence that the temple was built to house. If the sacred falcon was Horus, if the bird was, in the most literal theological sense, the god, then Macedonius did not merely kill a bird, he killed a god. He committed deicide. The theological implications of this act were, for the pagan community at Philae, catastrophic. If the living embodiment of Horus could be killed by a Christian bishop, if the god could be physically destroyed, then the god was not omnipotent. The god was vulnerable. The god could die. And the religion that worshipped the god was, by extension, vulnerable too. The killing of the falcon was not just an act of violence. It was a theological argument, a demonstration that the old gods were powerless against the new faith, that the sacred animals of the old religion were mere animals, that the divine presence that the priests claimed to detect in the falcon was an illusion. Whether the story of Macedonius and the falcon is historically accurate is debated. The source, a Coptic hagiographic text written decades or centuries after the events it describes, is not a neutral document. It is propaganda, a Christian victory narrative designed to celebrate the triumph of the faith over paganism. The details may be exaggerated, the event may be fabricated, but the emotional truth of the story, the image of a living god killed in its own temple by a representative of the religion that replaced it, captures, with brutal economy, the nature of the transition from pagan to Christian Egypt. The transition was not gentle, it was not negotiated. It was imposed by emperors, by soldiers, by bishops, by the institutional power of a state religion that had the authority and the willingness to suppress its competitors. The Temple of Isis at Philae resisted this imposition longer than any other temple in Egypt. It resisted for a century and a half, from Theodosius's edicts of 391 to Justinian's closure of 535. But the resistance was, ultimately, futile. The temple was closed. The priests were imprisoned, the statues were seized, the falcon was killed, and the old religion, the religion that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3 millennia, was extinguished at its last outpost. the extinguishing was complete. After 535, there is no evidence of organized Egyptian pagan worship anywhere in the Nile Valley. Individual beliefs may have persisted, folk practices, private devotions, remnants of the old religion surviving in attenuated form among rural communities. But the institutional infrastructure, the temples, the priesthoods, the ritual programs, the festivals, was destroyed. The transition from paganism to Christianity was, at Philae, not a transition at all. It was an amputation, the severing of a limb, the removal of a living organ from a living body, the killing of a tradition that was still active, still functioning, still serving the spiritual needs of its community. And the silence that followed the amputation was absolute. No more hymns to Isis, no more offerings to Horus, no more festivals of the divine birth, no more processions to the island of Bige, no more borrowing of the sacred statue by the Blemii priests, no more annual pilgrimages from the desert, no more daily rituals in the sanctuary. The temple fell silent. And the silence, the specific, dense, final silence of a living religion that has been forcibly extinguished, filled the sanctuary, the hypostyle hall, the forecourt, the colonnade, and the island itself, spreading outward across the water like a stain, reaching the cataracts and the desert and the horizon, until the entire landscape that the temple had once sanctified was covered in the silence of a world that had lost its gods. The silence lasted 14 centuries. The temple stood in its silence, Christian for a few centuries, then abandoned, then buried by silt, then partially submerged by the first Aswan Dam, then rescued and relocated by the UNESCO campaign. Through all of it, the conversion, the abandonment, the burial, the flooding, the rescue, the temple held its silence. The walls still bore the inscriptions, the reliefs still depicted the myths, the sanctuary still held the memory of the goddess. But the voice was gone, the ritual was not performed, and the silence, growing deeper with each century, with each annual submersion, with each layer of silt deposited on the submerged stone, became the temple's defining quality. Not its architecture, not its inscriptions, not its history, but its silence. The silence is still there. At Philae on Agilkia, in the sanctuary in the darkness, beside the place where the statue of Isis once stood, the silence of a goddess who was worshipped for 3 millennia and who has been silent for 15 centuries. The silence of a script that was used for 3,500 years, and that has been dead for 16 centuries. The silence of a priest named Esmet Akorm, who carved the last hieroglyph and then, without knowing it, fell silent forever. The deeper truth of Philae is the truth about what happens when a language dies. Not a spoken language. Spoken Egyptian evolved into Coptic, which survived as a liturgical language of the Coptic Christian Church. But a written language, the hieroglyphic script, the most ancient and most sacred writing system in Egypt, the script of the gods, the script of the temple walls, the script in which 3.5 millennia of Egyptian civilization had been recorded. Esmet Akorm's inscription of 394 is the death certificate of hieroglyphic writing. After that date, no one carved another hieroglyph, and within a generation or two, no one could read them. The script that had been in continuous use since the early dynastic period, the script that had recorded the names of every pharaoh, the prayers of every priest, the rituals of every temple, became unreadable. The walls of every temple in Egypt became mute. The inscriptions that covered every surface, the hymns, the narratives, the administrative records, the magical formulae, became indecipherable patterns of carved stone, beautiful but meaningless, seen by millions but understood by no one. Let that sink in. The death of hieroglyphic writing did not merely end a writing system. It locked 3,500 years of Egyptian civilization behind a door that no one could open. Every temple inscription, every tomb text, every papyrus written in hieroglyphic or hieratic script, all of it became inaccessible. The entire literary, religious, and historical heritage of ancient Egypt, one of the longest and most productive literate cultures in human history, was sealed in a script that no living person could read. The seal held for 14 centuries, from 394, the date of Esmet Akorm's last inscription, to 1822, when Jean-François Champollion announced his decipherment of the hieroglyphs using the Rosetta Stone. No human being on earth could read the writing on the walls of the Egyptian temples. The language was dead, the script was dead, and the knowledge, the incomprehensible, incalculable wealth of knowledge that the inscriptions contained, was locked away, inaccessible, preserved in stone, but hidden in silence. The unlocking of the hieroglyphic code, Champollion's decipherment, announced on the 27th of September, 1822, was the intellectual event that made Egyptology possible. Without it, the temples were beautiful but dumb. With it, the temples began to speak. And the Temple of Philae, the building where the last hieroglyph was carved, the place where the ancient script died, was, ironically, one of the first temples to be read after the decipherment. The hieroglyphs that Esmet had carved in 394 were among the earliest to be translated in the 1820s. The last words of the ancient language were among the first to be recovered by the modern science of Egyptology, and the words, when translated, were poignant. Esmet inscription is a simple dedication, an offering to a god, a prayer for blessing, a formulaic text of the kind that priests had been carving on temple walls for millennia. It contains no hint of finality, no awareness that this is the end, no farewell, no lament, no acknowledgement that the tradition is about to die. Esmet carved his inscription as if there would be another one tomorrow, as if the tradition would continue, as if the gods would endure. They did not. And the silence that followed Esmet inscription, the 14 centuries of unreadable hieroglyphs, the long night of the Egyptian script, is the silence that defines Philae. The temple is the last word, and the last word, when it came, did not know it was the last word. It thought it was just another word in an endless chain of words stretching back to the dawn of Egyptian civilization. It was not. It was the end. And the end, like most endings, was quiet, ordinary, and unaware of its own finality. This is not science fiction. This is the documented, verifiable, archaeologically attested death of a writing system, one of the most significant intellectual losses in the history of human civilization. And it happened here, at Philae, on an island in the Nile, in a temple dedicated to a goddess of magic. The last word was carved by a man whose family had served the temple for generations, and then the word stopped, and the silence began. The death of hieroglyphic writing at Philae raises questions about the death of languages that are as relevant today as they were in the 4th century of the Common Era. Languages die when the communities that speak them cease to transmit them to the next generation. The process is usually gradual. The language contracts from public use to private, from formal contexts to informal, from the mouths of the many to the mouths of the few, until the last speaker dies and the language is gone. The death of hieroglyphic writing followed this pattern, contracting from a national script used by thousands of scribes to a temple script used by a few dozen priests, and finally to a single inscription by a single priest on a single wall. But the death of hieroglyphic writing was also, in an important sense, deliberate. The Ptolemaic and Roman priests who maintained the hieroglyphic tradition at Philae and other temples had deliberately complexified the script, expanding the sign list from roughly 700 signs to more than 7,000, creating a writing system so arcane that only priests with years of specialized training could read it. This complexification was a survival strategy, a way of maintaining the priesthood's monopoly on sacred knowledge in a world where secular literacy was spreading and where the political power of the priesthood was under threat from foreign rulers. The strategy succeeded too well. By making the script inaccessible to outsiders, the priests also made it vulnerable to institutional collapse. When the temples closed and the priesthoods were dissolved, there was no one outside the temples who could read the hieroglyphs. The knowledge was concentrated in a tiny number of specialists, and when those specialists disappeared, imprisoned, dispersed, or simply dying without training successors, the knowledge disappeared with them. The over-specialization that was meant to protect the script ended up killing it. The parallel with modern endangered languages is striking. Many of the world's approximately 7,000 languages are currently endangered, spoken by fewer and fewer people, retreating from public to private use, losing their institutional support as education, government, and commerce shift to dominant languages. The death of these languages represents an incalculable loss. Each language is a unique system for categorizing, describing, and understanding the world, and its loss is the loss of a perspective that can never be recovered. But the death of hieroglyphic writing was not merely the death of a language. It was the death of an access code, the key that unlocked 3.5 millennia of accumulated knowledge. When the code died, the knowledge was locked away. Not destroyed, the inscriptions were still there, still carved in stone, still physically present on the walls of every temple in Egypt, but inaccessible, unreadable, silent. The knowledge existed, but no one could reach it. The library was intact, but the catalogue was gone. The books were on the shelves, but no one could open them. The recovery of the code, Champollion's decipherment of 1822, was the event that opened the library, and the opening has been ongoing for 2 centuries. Each new translation of an Egyptian text, each new reading of a temple wall, each new interpretation of a papyrus, each new decipherment of a damaged inscription is an act of recovery, an act of reaching into the locked library, pulling out a book, and reading it for the first time in 2,000 years. The recovery is far from complete. Many inscriptions remain untranslated, many texts remain misunderstood, many words remain uncertain. The Ptolemaic hieroglyphic system, with its 7,000 signs and its deliberate obscurity, is among the most challenging writing systems that Egyptologists must navigate. The reading of Philae's inscriptions is ongoing work that will continue for decades, perhaps centuries, as scholars slowly and painstakingly extract the knowledge that the temple walls contain. And the knowledge is worth extracting. The inscriptions at Philae include hymns to Isis that are among the most beautiful literary texts from the Ptolemaic period, poetic compositions that praise the goddess in language that is both formal and emotionally resonant. They include mythological narratives, the story of Isis and Osiris, the search for the dismembered body, the magical resurrection, the conception and birth of Horus, told in versions that incorporate details and episodes not found in earlier sources. They include ritual texts, the daily service, the festival liturgy, the prayers for the dead, that describe the temple's operations with the same exhaustive detail found at Edfu, and they include graffiti, informal inscriptions by visitors, pilgrims, and priests who carved their names, their prayers, and their observations on the temple walls, adding their own voices to the institutional chorus of the temple's formal texts. The graffiti at Philae are especially valuable because they include texts in multiple languages and scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, Greek, and Meroitic. The multilingual graffiti reflect the international character of the Isis cult. The fact that the temple attracted worshippers from across the Mediterranean and African worlds, each one bringing their own language and their own writing system to the sacred island. The graffiti are the voices of individuals, named men and women, with specific origins and specific prayers, who visited Philae and left their marks on the stone. They humanize the temple. They transform it from an abstract institution into a community of believers, a community that included Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Nubians, and peoples from as far away as Meroe, the capital of the Kushite kingdom in modern Sudan. The Meroitic inscriptions at Philae are of particular interest because the Meroitic language, the language of the Kushite kingdom of Meroe, remains only partially deciphered. The Meroitic script, which was adapted from Egyptian Demotic, can be read phonetically. The sounds of the signs are known, but the meaning of most Meroitic words is still uncertain. The Meroitic graffiti at Philae represent an opportunity. The juxtaposition of Meroitic texts with Egyptian and Greek texts on the same walls in the same temple, dealing with the same religious subjects, may eventually provide the bilingual evidence needed to advance the decipherment of the Meroitic language. Philae, the temple where the last Egyptian hieroglyph was carved, may also prove to be the key to unlocking one of the last undeciphered scripts of the ancient world. The European fascination with Philae began in the late 18th century, when Napoleon's expedition of 1798 produced the first systematic descriptions and drawings of the island temple. The savants who accompanied the French army were overwhelmed by Philae's beauty, the combination of water, stone, and vegetation creating a scene that appealed to every instinct of the romantic sensibility. The island was small, the temple was elegant, the setting was dramatic, water on all sides, desert on the horizon, the roar of the cataracts in the background. Philae was, for the European imagination, the epitome of the romantic ruin, beautiful, melancholy, ancient, and irretrievably lost. David Roberts, the Scottish painter, who visited Egypt in 1838 and 1839, produced a series of watercolours and lithographs of Philae that became among the most famous images of ancient Egypt in the 19th century. Roberts depicted the temple as he found it, its columns rising from the water's edge, its walls glowing in the southern sunlight, its kiosk reflecting in the calm surface of the Nile. The images were widely reproduced and deeply influential. They established Philae in the European imagination as the quintessential Egyptian monument, the place where the beauty of the ancient world was most perfectly preserved and most hauntingly displayed. But Roberts' images also documented a temple that was already under threat. The growth of the modern town of Aswan, the increasing traffic on the Nile, and the gradual silting of the channels around the island were all contributing to the deterioration of the temple complex, and the construction of the first Aswan Dam at the end of the 19th century would transform Philae from a picturesque ruin into a drowning monument. The island submerged for months each year, its painted surfaces washed away by the annual flood, its carved reliefs coated with the grey silt of the Nile. The annual submersion of Philae, which continued from 1902 to the early 1970s, was one of the most painful episodes in the modern history of Egyptian heritage. Visitors who arrived during the flood season found the temple partially or fully underwater, the columns rising from the lake like the masts of a sunken ship, the pylons half submerged, the forecourt navigable only by boat. The sight was atmospheric but heartbreaking, a great temple, drowning slowly, year by year, with each annual submersion washing away a little more of the original surface. The paint that Roberts had documented in 1838 was largely gone by the middle of the 20th century, dissolved by the water, deposited as silt on the lake bottom, irretrievably lost. The UNESCO relocation campaign of 1972 to 1980 saved the temple from total submersion, but could not undo the damage of 70 years of annual flooding. The grey waterline that marks the temple's lower walls is a permanent scar, a visible record of the decades of drowning that preceded the rescue. Above the line, the stone is warm, golden, alive. Below the line, the stone is grey, pitted, dead. The boundary between the two zones is the boundary between the temple's two modern lives. The life before the dam, when Philae was a dry island temple surrounded by the roar of the cataracts, and the life after the dam, when Philae was a drowning monument, submerged for months each year, its surfaces slowly dissolving in the waters of the reservoir. The relocation ended the drowning. The temple on Agilkia is above the waterline of Lake Nasser. It will not be flooded again. But the damage of 70 years of submersion is permanent, visible, measurable, irreversible. The temple that stands on Agilkia is not the temple that Roberts painted. It is a diminished version, its colours faded, its lower surfaces scarred, its carved details softened by decades of water damage. The relocation saved the form. It could not save the surface. And the surface is where the art lives. The surface is where the painted reliefs told their stories. The surface is where the colours, the reds, the blues, the greens, the yellows, brought the carved figures to life. The surface is where the hieroglyphs were most legible, where the details were most visible, where the craftsmanship of the Ptolemaic carvers was most evident. The loss of the surface, the slow annual chemical dissolution of the painted plaster by the waters of the first Aswan Dam, is the loss that the relocation could not prevent and that conservation cannot reverse. The modern conservation of Philae, conducted by Egyptian and international teams, focuses on stabilizing what remains, preventing further deterioration of the surfaces that survived the flooding, consolidating the sandstone that was weakened by decades of moisture absorption, and documenting every inscription, every relief, every decorative detail before time and chemistry erase them. The work is painstaking, slow, and never finished. Each season brings new challenges, new areas of deterioration, new surfaces that require intervention, new inscriptions that need to be recorded before they become illegible, and the inscriptions are worth recording. The texts at Philae include some of the most important religious literature from the late Ptolemaic and Roman periods: hymns to Isis, narratives of the Osiris myth, ritual prescriptions for the daily service, and the diplomatic texts that record the unique treaty arrangements between the Roman government and the Nubian tribes. These texts, carved on the walls of a temple that has been flooded, relocated, and exposed to a century of environmental stress, are deteriorating. Their deterioration is measurable, their loss is progressive, and the work of recording them, of copying, translating, photographing, and publishing every text before it becomes unreadable, is a race against time that the scholars of Philae are conducting with the same dedication and the same urgency that Esmet Akum brought to the carving of his last hieroglyph 16 centuries ago. The scholars are writing against the darkness. Esmet Akum was writing against the silence. The tools are different, the urgency is the same. And the temple, standing on its new island, facing the calm waters of the lake, its columns catching the Aswan sunset, holds both efforts in its stones: the ancient effort to preserve a tradition, the modern effort to preserve a monument. Both are acts of devotion, both are acts of defiance against the forces that destroy what human beings create, and both in the end are insufficient. The tradition died, the monument is deteriorating, and the gap between human effort and cosmic indifference, the gap that every preservationist must learn to live with, is the space in which the Temple of Philae endures. The Osiris chambers at Philae, the small rooms above the sanctuary, accessible by a narrow staircase from the hypostyle hall, contain some of the most theologically dense inscriptions in the entire temple complex. The chambers are dedicated to the mythology of Osiris's death and resurrection, and their walls are covered with scenes that depict every stage of the mythological cycle, from Seth's murder of Osiris to Isis's magical resurrection of the dead god. The scenes are accompanied by extensive hieroglyphic texts that provide the liturgical context, the hymns, the prayers, the ritual actions that accompanied each stage of the myth. The most remarkable scene in the Osite chambers depicts the moment of resurrection. Isis bending over the prone body of Osiris, her wings spread in a gesture of magical protection, the breath of life passing from her mouth to his. The scene is both mythological and metaphysical. It depicts a specific moment in a specific narrative, but it also embodies a universal principle. The principle that love can overcome death, that devotion can transcend destruction, that the power of the goddess is sufficient to reverse the most final of all endings. This principle, the defeat of death through love and magic, is the theological core of the Temple of Philae. It is the idea that animates every relief, every inscription, every ritual action described on the temple walls. The goddess loves, the god dies, the goddess searches, the goddess finds, the goddess reassembles, the goddess breathes life. The god is restored, not to the world of the living, but to the world beyond death, where he rules as king, where he judges the souls of the dead, where he ensures that the cosmic order endures beyond the grave. The temple at Philae was the place where this principle was enacted, where the priests performed the rituals that sustained the goddess's magical power, where the offerings fed the god's eternal hunger, where the daily service maintained the cosmic machinery that kept death at bay and order in place. The temple was not a memorial, it was a mechanism, a cosmic engine, powered by ritual, fueled by devotion, designed to produce a specific outcome: the continuation of life beyond death, the maintenance of order beyond chaos, the persistence of love beyond destruction. The mechanism has stopped, the cosmic engine is silent, the daily service is not performed, the offerings are not made, and the principle that love defeats death, that devotion reverses destruction, that the goddess's magical power is sufficient to restore what has been destroyed, is no longer enacted in the temple's rituals. But the principle is still inscribed on the temple's walls, still carved in hieroglyphs that can be read, still depicted in reliefs that can be seen, still present in the architecture that contains them. The principle outlasted the ritual, the idea outlasted the institution, and the temple, the building that housed both, outlasted everything. It outlasted the ritual, which ceased in 535. It outlasted the language, which died in 394. It outlasted the island, which was drowned by the dam. It outlasted the sound of the cataracts, which was silenced by the reservoir. It outlasted everything, every element of its original context, every feature of its original setting, every practice that gave it meaning. And it stands today on a new island, in calm water, under a quiet sky, with nothing left of its original world except the stones and the inscriptions and the memory of a goddess who loved her husband enough to bring him back from the dead. The stones are enough, the inscriptions are enough, the memory is enough, because the story they tell, the story of love defeating death, of devotion overcoming destruction, of a goddess who refused to accept the finality of her husband's murder, is a story that does not require a function temple to be meaningful. It does not require a living priesthood. It does not require a sacred falcon or a golden statue or the roar of the cataracts. It requires only a reader, a human being who stands before the wall, reads the inscription, sees the relief, and understands what the story means. The story means that death is not the end, that love is stronger than destruction, that the things we create out of devotion can outlast the worlds that create them. The temple proves this. It has outlasted the world that created it. It has outlasted the language of its creators. It has outlasted the island on which it stood, and it endures, not because it is made of eternal material, but because the story it tells is eternal. The story of Isis and Osiris, the story of love and death, the story of the last temple, the last hieroglyph, the last priest, the last offering, the last word of a civilization that refused until the very end to stop speaking. The word endures, the temple endures, the story endures, and the goddess, however we understand her, in whatever form we recognize her, through whatever language we name her, endures too, in the stones of Philae, in the waters of the Nile, in the last inscription of the last priest of the last temple, in the silence that followed, and in the reading, the modern, scholarly, patient, devoted reading of the inscriptions that has broken the silence, recovered the language, and given the goddess her voice again. Stand on the eastern shore of Agilkia Island beside the kiosk of Trajan and look out over the water. The Nile stretches south toward the cataracts. The desert hills rise on either side. The sky is vast and pale, and the kiosk, Trajan's graceful pavilion, its unfinished columns catching the afternoon light, stands behind you, framing the view with the elegance of an architectural masterpiece that was never completed. This view, the water, the hills, the sky, the columns, is one of the most photographed and most painted scenes in Egypt. David Roberts painted it in 1838. Thousands of 19th century travellers sketched it, described it, and rhapsodized about it in their published journals. Philae was, for more than a century, the most romantic destination in Egypt, an island temple surrounded by water, accessible only by boat, its columns reflected in the Nile, its stones warmed by the southern sun. The European romantic imagination found in Philae everything it sought: beauty, melancholy, the picturesque decay of a vanished civilization, the haunting presence of gods who had been dead for centuries but whose temples still stood. And then the dam came. The first Aswan Dam, the Low Dam, built between 1898 and 1902, partially submerged Philae. The dam was designed to regulate the Nile flood, and its reservoir, when full, raised the water level to a height that covered the lower portions of the temple complex for several months each year. The annual submersion was damaging. The water deposited silt on the carved surfaces, dissolved the mineral salts in the sandstone, and washed away the paint that had survived in the temple's interior chambers. The temple was drowning, slowly, annually, predictably, and the international community watched with concern but without the will or the resources to intervene. The construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s raised the stakes dramatically. The High Dam's reservoir, Lake Nasser, would raise the water level permanently, submerging Philae not for a few months each year, but forever. The island would disappear beneath the lake. The temple would be drowned, and the last functioning Egyptian temple, the building where the last hieroglyph was carved, the place where the worship of Isis had outlasted every other pagan cult in the Roman Empire, would be lost. The UNESCO campaign to save Philae began in 1960 and continued until 1980. The operation was simpler in concept than the Abu Simbel rescue, but no less ambitious in execution. The temple was not carved from a cliff, as Abu Simbel was. It was built from blocks, which made it easier to dismantle. But the complex was larger. The number of individual blocks was greater, and the logistics of moving 40,000 stones weighing 27,000 tons to a neighboring island were formidable. The operation proceeded in stages. First, a coffer dam was built around Philae Island, draining the water and exposing the submerged portions of the temple for the first time in decades. Then, each stone was numbered, photographed, and catalogued according to its position in the original structure. Then, the stones were lifted by crane, transported by barge to Agilkia Island, and placed in their new positions according to the original plan. The reassembly reproduced the original configuration with high fidelity. The temple on Agilkia looks, to the casual visitor, identical to the temple as it appeared on Philae. But the island is different. The landscape is different. The relationship between the temple and the water has changed. And the original Philae, the island where Esmetak carved the last hieroglyph, the island where the worship of Isis outlasted every other temple in Egypt, is underwater, invisible, unreachable, drowned. The relocated temple is not the original. It is a faithful reproduction, a meticulous reconstruction, assembled from original stones, in original configurations, on a carefully prepared island. But it is not on Philae. And the original Philae, the actual place where the events described in this documentary occurred, the actual island where Isis mourned Osiris across the channel, the actual ground where the last priests of the old religion served their goddess, is gone, swallowed by the lake, drowned by the dam, sacrificed to the modern need for electricity and flood control. The sacrifice was real, and it was painful. The original island of Philae was not merely a platform for a temple. It was a sacred landscape, a specific configuration of rock, water, and vegetation that had accumulated meaning over centuries. The relationship between Philae and Bige, the island where Osiris was buried, visible across the channel, was a fundamental element of the temple's theology. The sound of the cataract, the rushing water that surrounded the island and that symbolized the primordial waters of chaos, was part of the sensory experience of the sacred site. These elements, the view of Bige, the sound of the cataract, the specific quality of the light on the water, cannot be relocated. They belong to the original island, and the original island is gone. The implications of Philae's story for the modern world extend beyond the narrowly archaeological. The temple raises questions about the relationship between political power and religious practice that are as relevant in the 21st century as they were in the 5th. The Roman Empire's attempt to suppress pagan worship through legislative decree, Theodosius's edicts of 391 and 392, was one of the most ambitious programs of religious uniformity in pre-modern history. The edicts did not merely prohibit specific practices, they criminalized an entire category of religious behavior, declaring that the worship of the old gods was not merely wrong but illegal, punishable by the state, enforceable by the army. The edicts largely succeeded. Across the Roman Empire, pagan temples were closed, their properties confiscated, their priesthoods dissolved, their congregations dispersed. The suppression was not always violent. In many cases, the pagan communities simply converted, accepting the new religion with varying degrees of enthusiasm and sincerity. But in some cases, the suppression was brutal. Temples were demolished, priests were persecuted, sacred objects were destroyed, and the faithful were forced underground or into exile. Philae was the exception that proved the rule. The temple survived not because the imperial will was weak, but because the imperial will was pragmatic. The frontier required peace. Peace required the Blemies and the Nobatai, and the Blemies and the Nobatai required Isis. The equation was simple. The result was extraordinary. A century and a half of legal pagan worship in a legally Christian empire, sustained not by defiance but by diplomacy, not by resistance but by negotiation, not by faith alone but by faith backed by military power. The lesson is that religious institutions survive when they serve functions that secular authorities cannot easily replace. The Temple of Isis at Philae was not merely a house of worship. It was a diplomatic instrument. a tool for managing the relationship between the empire and its frontier tribes. As long as the temple served that function, the empire had a reason to keep it open. When the function ceased, when the nobility converted to Christianity and the diplomatic necessity of maintaining the temple disappeared, the temple was closed. The faith did not save the temple. The function did. And when the function ended, the faith was not sufficient to sustain it. This dynamic, the instrumentalization of religion by political power, is one of the oldest patterns in human history. The pharaohs instrumentalized the worship of Amun to legitimize their rule. The Ptolemies instrumentalized the worship of Egyptian gods to maintain their control over the Egyptian population. The Romans instrumentalized the worship of Isis to manage their southern frontier. In each case, the religious institution served a political function, and in each case, the political function, not the religious belief, determined the institution's fate. The modern world is not immune to this dynamic. Religious institutions continue to serve political functions as instruments of social cohesion, as providers of social services, as vehicles for political mobilization, as symbols of national identity. And the fate of those institutions continues to be determined, in large part, by their political utility. Institutions that serve useful political functions are supported and sustained. Institutions that cease to serve useful functions are defunded, marginalized, and, in some cases, suppressed. The Temple of Philae teaches us that the survival of a religious institution depends not on the purity of its doctrine, the sincerity of its practitioners, or the beauty of its architecture. It depends on its utility, on its capacity to serve functions that the surrounding society values, and that no other institution can easily provide. The worship of Isis survived at Philae because it served a diplomatic function that Christianity could not replace. When Christianity learned to replace it, when the nobility converted, and the diplomatic necessity of the temple disappeared, the temple was closed. The lesson is stark, the lesson is uncomfortable, and the lesson is inscribed on the walls of the last functioning Egyptian temple, in the last hieroglyphic inscription, carved by the last priest of a religion that had served its utility and was about to be discarded. The kiosk of Trajan stands on the eastern shore of Agilkia Island as a monument to this uncomfortable truth. The kiosk was built by a Roman emperor, a ruler who worshipped different gods, spoke a different language, and governed from a different continent. Trajan built the kiosk not because he believed in Isis, but because he understood the political value of the Isis cult. The kiosk is a political monument, a Roman structure, built in Egyptian function, serving an Egyptian function, funded by Roman money, designed to demonstrate Roman respect for Egyptian tradition. The kiosk is not sincere, it is strategic. And the distinction between sincerity and strategy is the distinction that runs through the entire history of Philae, from the first Ptolemaic stones to the last hieroglyphic inscription. The question the temple poses is not, was the worship of Isis genuine? The worship was genuine. The priests believed, the pilgrims prayed, the rituals were performed with conviction and devotion. The question is, was the preservation of the worship genuine? Was the Roman government's decision to keep the temple open motivated by respect for the Isis cult, or by the strategic calculation that closing it would destabilize the frontier? The answer, almost certainly, is the latter. The empire kept the temple open not because it valued the worship, but because it valued the peace that the worship sustained. And when the peace could be sustained by other means, when the nobility converted to Christianity and the frontier could be managed without the temple was closed. The worship was no longer needed, the peace was secure, and the temple, the last outpost of the old religion, the place where the gods of Egypt were honored for the last time, the building where a priest named Esmet Akom carved the last hieroglyph in the history of the world, was shut down. Not because the gods had failed, not because the worship was invalid, but because the function had been served and the utility had expired. The geographical relationship between Philae and the wider network of Osiris cult sites across Egypt places the island within a mythological landscape of extraordinary scope. According to Egyptian tradition, the body of Osiris was dismembered by Seth and scattered across Egypt, each piece landing in a different location, each location becoming a sacred site dedicated to the part of the body it received. The tradition enumerated either 14 or 42 body parts, depending on the version, and the cult sites associated with these body parts were distributed across the length of the Nile Valley, from the delta to the cataracts. Philae's claim that the left leg of Osiris was buried on the neighbouring island of Bige placed the island at the southernmost extremity of this sacred geography, at the point where the mythological landscape of Osiris met the physical landscape of the Nile. This position at the southern limit of the Osiris geography gave Philae a special character within the larger Egyptian religious system. The temple was not merely one cult site among many, it was the border station, the last outpost of the Egyptian sacred landscape before the Nile disappeared into the territories of Nubia and the unknown south. The pilgrims who travelled to Philae were not merely visiting a temple, they were travelling to the edge of the known world, to the point where Egypt ended, where the river narrowed, where the cataracts marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between order and chaos, between the world of the gods and the world of the unknown. The cataracts themselves were sacred. The ancient Egyptians believed that the annual Nile flood originated at the cataracts, that the god Khnum, seated in a cavern beneath the first cataract, released the floodwaters each year by opening a set of divine gates. The sound of the cataracts, the thundering, roaring, echoing sound of millions of tons of water crashing over granite boulders, was understood as the sound of creation itself, the sound of the primordial waters breaking through the earth's crust, the sound of the boundary between the underworld and the world of the living. The temple at Philae, surrounded by this sound, existed in an acoustic environment that was unique among Egyptian temples, a constant, overwhelming, sacred noise that was the audible signature of the divine. The loss of this acoustic environment through the construction of the Aswan dams is one of the most significant but least discussed consequences of the modern transformation of the Nile Valley. The first cataract, which once produced a thunderous roar audible for kilometers, is now largely silenced. Its waters regulated by the dams, its rocks submerged by the reservoir, its rapids reduced to a gentle flow between engineered channels. The sound that defined Philae, the sound that the priests heard every morning as they entered the temple, the sound that the pilgrims heard as their boats approached the island, the sound that the gods themselves were believed to produce, is gone, replaced by the hum of hydroelectric turbines and the quiet lapping of lake water against artificial shores. The relocated temple on Agilkia preserves the stones but not the sound. It preserves the inscriptions but not the acoustic context in which they were carved. It preserves the sanctuary but not the roar of creation that once surrounded it. The temple is, in acoustic terms, a silent facsimile of a noisy original, a building that was designed to exist within a specific soundscape, and that has been removed from that soundscape and placed in a different, quieter, calmer one. The change is not visible, it cannot be photographed, it does not appear in the archaeological record, but it is real, and it alters, fundamentally and permanently, the experience of the temple for anyone who visits it. The modern experience of Philae is shaped by the boat ride, the island setting, the warm Aswan light, and the evocative beauty of the Ptolemaic and Roman architecture. Visitors consistently describe Philae as one of the most atmospheric archaeological sites in Egypt, more intimate than Karnak, more accessible than Abu Simbel, more romantic than Edfu. The temple's relatively small scale, its island setting, its reflection in the water, and its association with the goddess of love and magic combine to create an experience that is emotionally resonant in a way that the larger, more imposing temples of Upper Egypt do not always achieve. The emotional resonance is not accidental, it is architectural. The temple was designed to create an intimate encounter with the divine, to bring the worshipper close to the goddess, to narrow the space between the human and the sacred, to concentrate the experience of worship into a small, enclosed, intensely decorated space. The sanctuary at Philae is one of the smallest in Egypt. The hypostyle hall is one of the most intimate. The forecourt is one of the most human in scale. Everything about the temple's design says, "Come closer, come nearer, the goddess is here, she is waiting." And the goddess, for all the centuries of silence, for all the destruction and the flooding and the relocation, still feels present at Philae, not as a theological reality, but as an architectural one. The building creates her presence, the proportions evoke her, the darkness of the sanctuary summons her, the reliefs depict her, nursing her son, mourning her husband, spreading her wings in a gesture of magical protection. The goddess is in the architecture, she is in the proportions, she is in the play of light on water and stone, she is in the experience of arriving by boat at an island temple, of crossing the water from the ordinary world to the sacred, of entering a building that was designed, with extraordinary skill and extraordinary devotion, to contain the presence of the divine. The divine is gone, the architecture remains, and the architecture at Philae is so perfectly calibrated to its purpose, so perfectly designed to create the conditions for encounter with the sacred, that the visitor feels the presence of the goddess, even in her absence. The empty sanctuary speaks, the damaged reliefs communicate, the silent walls convey meaning. The building, stripped of its god and its priests and its rituals and its sound, still does what it was designed to do. It creates the conditions for the experience of the sacred, not the reality of the sacred, the experience, and the experience at Philae is powerful enough to survive the death of the reality that once sustained it. This is the final paradox of the Temple of Philae. The last functioning Egyptian temple continues to function, not as a religious institution but as an architectural experience. The building still works, the proportions still move, the darkness still evokes, the water still reflects, and the visitor, crossing the lake in a motorboat, stepping onto the island, walking through the colonnade, entering the hypostyle hall, and standing in the sanctuary in the darkness, still feels, however briefly, however incompletely, however differently from the ancient priests, the presence of something larger than themselves, something that the building was designed to contain, something that the architecture creates. The goddess is in the stone, the goddess is in the water, the goddess is in the light that enters the hypostyle hall at sunset and turns the columns to gold. And the goddess of magic, the goddess of motherhood, the goddess who brought the dead back to life, endures, not in belief, not in worship, but in architecture, in the stone and the water and the light of the last temple that ever bore her name. So what is the Temple of Philae? It is the last functioning Egyptian temple, the building where the worship of the old gods continued for more than a century after every other temple in Egypt had been closed. It is the place where the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved by a priest named Esmet Akum on the 24th of August, 394 of the Common Era, in a script that had been in continuous use for more than 3,500 years. It is the temple that survived by treaty, protected from Christian closure by the diplomatic necessity of maintaining peace with the Blemmyes and the Nobatai, the Nubian tribes who worshipped Isis and who fought to preserve their access to her sacred island. And it is the temple that was saved by engineering, dismantled, transported and reassembled on a neighbouring island to escape the rising waters of Lake Nasser. The Temple of Philae is a monument to persistence, the persistence of the worship of Isis, which outlasted the Roman Empire's conversion to Christianity, the persistence of hieroglyphic writing, which continued at Philae for decades after it had ceased everywhere else, the persistence of the priestly families who served the temple, passing their knowledge and their responsibilities from generation to generation, maintaining the rituals and the traditions of a religion that the outside world had abandoned, and the persistence of the modern world's commitment to the temple's preservation. The 8-year UNESCO campaign that saved the building from drowning, and that ensured that the last hieroglyphic inscription would continue to be readable for centuries to come. But Philae is also a monument to loss. The loss of a language, the hieroglyphic script, which died at Philae in 394 and remained unreadable for 14 centuries. The loss of a religion, the worship of Isis, which was extinguished at Philae in 535 by soldiers who imprisoned the priests, seized the statues, and killed the sacred falcon. The loss of an island, the original Philae, now submerged beneath Lake Nasser, unreachable, invisible, gone. And the loss of a world, the world of the old gods, the world of the daily ritual, the world of the morning offering and the evening prayer, the world in which a priest could stand before a golden statue in a granite shrine and believe, with absolute conviction, that the goddess was present, that the offerings were received, that the ritual was effective, that the cosmic order depended on his actions. That world is gone. The temple that housed it is still standing, relocated, reconstructed, preserved by modern engineering on a modern island. The inscriptions that described it are still legible, carved in stone, readable to anyone with a knowledge of hieroglyphs and a willingness to learn. The mythology that sustained it is still known. The story of Isis and Osiris, of death and resurrection, of the goddess who reassembled her husband's body and breathed life back into him through the power of magic. The story is still told, the ritual is not performed, and the gap between the two, between the story we can still tell and the ritual we can no longer perform, is the gap that separates us from the world that the Temple of Philae was built to serve. The boat carries the visitor back to the mainland. The island recedes. The columns shrink. The kiosk, which was the first thing visible on the approach, is the last thing visible on the departure. A silhouette of graceful columns against the evening sky, standing on an island that is not the island it was built on, in a temple that is not where it was built, dedicated to a goddess who is no longer worshipped, inscribed with the last words of a language that was dead for 14 centuries before anyone learned to read it again. The last hieroglyph, the last offering, the last prayer, the last priest, imprisoned by soldiers, watching his god statue being carried away to a foreign capital, the last living falcon, burned by a bishop, the last words of a 3,500-year tradition, carved in stone by a man who did not know they were the last. The temple stands on its new island, the water laps at the shore, the columns catch the light, and the inscription of Esmet Akhom, small, competent, unremarkable, the most important sentence in the history of Egyptian writing, is still there, still carved, still readable, still saying what it has been saying since the 24th of August, 394 of the Common Era. A prayer to a god, an offering from a priest, a word in a language that was about to die. The word endures, the language does not. The temple endures, the religion does not. The island endures, a different island, but an island. And the goddess, Isis, the great mother, the mistress of magic, the goddess who brought her husband back from the dead, endures in the only way that a goddess can endure after her last temple has been closed, and her last priest has been imprisoned, and her last falcon has been killed. She endures in the story, in the inscription, in the stones that were cut and numbered and shipped across the water and reassembled on a new shore. She endures because someone cared enough to save her temple, because 50 nations contributed to the rescue, because engineers and archaeologists and workers spent 8 years dismantling and rebuilding a monument to a goddess they did not worship, in a language they could not read, for a religion they did not share. That act of preservation, that secular international multi-year act of devotion to a building, and the idea it represents, is the last offering that Isis has received. Not bread, not beer, not incense or wine or the blood of a sacred bull, but labor, human labor directed at the saving of a human creation in the name of a human value, the value of memory, of continuity, of refusing to let the silence be final. The offering was accepted. The temple stands. And the last hieroglyph, carved by the last priest of the last temple, on the last day of a 3,500-year tradition, is still there, on a wall, on an island, in the Nile, at the edge of the desert, at the boundary between Egypt and Nubia, between the living and the dead, between the ancient world and the modern one. Still there, still readable, still after everything, speaking.